to Straight from the Gavel. I'm your host, Dave Barber, coming to you today from the House Lounge inside the Rhode Island State House. And in these segments, we like to sit down for a half an hour and talk with a member of the General Assembly and discuss some of the things they've been working on and its impact on Rhode Island. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to welcome a gentleman to our show today. Making his first appearance on Straight from the Gavel, the Honorable State Representative Chris Blazejewski. Representative, it's great to see you.
Dave, good to see you, and thank you for having me.
Well, it's good to have you here. And one of the things we like to do, especially when we have a freshman member of the Rhode Island General Assembly, is have them give a little background about themselves, both personally and professionally, and let our viewers get to know a little more about them. So tell us about yourself.
Sure, I represent District 2. Which is in Providence and is composed of Fox Point, Wayland Square, parts of downtown Providence, all the way from the State House down to Rhode Island Hospital. It is a diverse district. There are students, there are professionals, there are working class people, there's public housing. It is a very diverse district, and I'm proud to support it. I'm actually originally, I grew up in North Smithfield, if you believe it, on a dairy farm for the first 8 years of my life. And then I moved to Cumberland, went to Cumberland High School, and then went on to college and law school and moved back to Rhode Island after all that because Rhode Island's my home. My wife is from North Providence. She's a teacher in Johnston. We're Rhode Islanders through and through.
Well, I know that you and your colleagues in the General Assembly have had a lot on your plate this session. And one of the big areas of concern, and you hear it talked about across the country, is campaign finance reform, especially now what's happening with these super PACs. Tell us about your legislation that deals with campaign finance reform.
Sure. It is a bill that provides for disclosure of what are called independent expenditures in electioneering communications. And at first, I'd like to thank Speaker Fox for his leadership on this issue, as well as Governor Chafee, Senate President Paiva-Weed, the Senate sponsor Juan Pichardo. They're all on board because I think they recognize that disclosure of these independent expenditures is critical for two reasons. One, to fight corruption, and two, to empower voters.
Well, was there something, though, specifically that prompted you to introduce this legislation?
Sure. So in the beginning of 2010, the United States Supreme Court issued a decision that is perhaps the most unpopular in many years, called Citizens United. And what Citizens United did was open the floodgates to unknown, unlimited amounts of corporate spending in our politics on what are called independent expenditures. And if anyone out there has, watching the show, has followed Stephen Colbert in his work with his PAC down in South Carolina, you can see how the notion of them really being independent is really more fiction than fact. And as we've seen the Republican nomination process go from state to state and the super PACs acting in a way that has really hurt our democracy, I think it's critical that we pass a piece of legislation here to deal with the state impacts of these potential super PACs before they come here and resist that legislation. And I really appreciate the leadership in the House, Senate, and Governor on this issue.
Well, you indicate that you have a lot of support for this. And I think what you alluded to with what's happened with the Republicans on a national level, I don't think they were banking on. These super PACs funneled a lot of money into various Republican campaigns for president, and boy, they've gotten beaten up pretty bad over some of these, with this money that's been used to infuse these campaigns.
Sure, and why is this important in Rhode Island? Well, Rhode Island, as I've said many times, in the campaign finance world, is a small boat on a big ocean. We're 1 million people in a country of 300 million, in a world of 6 billion. A dollar spent in Rhode Island can go really far and can impact our elections. And it is critical that we have the disclosure because, one, as I said, the corruption piece, you want to know whether or not independent expenditures are being made and then there's quid pro quo afterwards after the candidate wins. And secondly, voters, in order to assess the reliability of the message that they're hearing, they need to be able to know who stands behind the message. I'm an attorney, and I do trial work. I represent small businesses and nonprofits, and I see all the time in court. The reason you have trials in court is because an important part of understanding evidence is assessing the reliability of the person saying it. Mm-hmm. And what this bill will do is allow people to find out who's behind the message that they're hearing and why are they promoting that message. or that candidate.
And you almost seem to hear, Representative, across the board, from people inside of politics and outside of politics, something has to be done about the money that's involved in the political process right now. You know, nothing's going to really change unless we can change some of these campaign finance laws that seemingly, even to both sides of the aisle, out of control, and there needs to be drastic change.
Sure. And so the Citizens United decision in 2010 was followed by a DC Circuit's decision called Speech Now. And that one has really created a huge problem, which allowed for unlimited spending by C4s. And so what you've seen in the aftermath is the creation of these C4s by Karl Rove and others that are these shell corporations that don't allow you to see behind what they're spending money on. And that's important because we need to understand that Citizens United provided for at least one mechanism. They said that we couldn't limit the spending, but we could require disclosure and require transparency. This C4 problem has now emerged, and it's why we need to deal with it. And I'd like to mention another bill. It's not mine, but it's Speaker Fox's that is a resolution to request the United States Congress to issue an amendment to our Constitution to fix the Citizens United problem. We've created these corporations that are, they can live forever, they can amass untold amounts of money, and now they can tap their general treasury to influence our elections, and we need to do something about it.
So if you're successful, if I understand you correctly, at least with this transparency, we'll be able to put names and faces with the money. So we'll at least know where the money is coming from and who's behind it, right?
That's exactly right, Dave.
Okay, well, it's very interesting. And one of the things that we like to do in this particular segment, since we get a member of the General Assembly in for an extended period of time, is talk about some of the legislation that you've specifically worked on. There's been a lot of talk about the restaurant business this session here in Rhode Island because of the governor's proposed increase in the food and beverage tax, and I'll ask you about that in a moment. But one of the things in my research and preparing for today that I was not aware of, you've worked on some legislation that deals with servers or people that work in the service industry that have to split their tips. I was not aware of this. Bring our viewers up to date on it, and why was this legislation necessary?
Well, when I'm knocking on doors over the summer, like I said, I've got a working class community. I've got students that are working 2 jobs, that are working a second job on top of their studies. So they're often in the service industry. Mm-hmm. And I was surprised to hear about it too, but it happens every day. And if you talk to anybody who's ever worked in the service industry, they'll tell you it happens. And what it is you as a patron come into a restaurant, you get good service, you provide a nice tip, and you expect that tip goes to the employee that provided that service, perhaps split with the busboy and some of the other service employees that work in the restaurant or the hotel, but not with management. You wouldn't expect that management would be taking a cut, the owner of the business. And why is that detrimental? Well, oftentimes, for workers in the service industry.
Wait a minute, excuse me. You're suggesting to me that an owner of a restaurant might be taking a percentage of that gratuity left to a server?
It happens all the time, and I'm telling you it happens. We've had testimony in favor of this bill that supports it, and if you go and you talk to anyone who's working in the industry, it happens more than you expect, and that's why Massachusetts, New York, California have passed legislation that make it illegal to pool tips with management or allow management to take a cut of tips, because frankly, it's unfair to the workers who in many cases are making less than minimum wage. Secondly, it's a fraud upon the consumer and the patron who believes that they are rewarding a worker for their hard work, and in fact, they're just lining the pockets of the owner in a way that they didn't expect.
Well, I must have been really naive because until now, I have not heard of this. What have the employees told you? What does management say to them? Have they given you any feedback as to how do they justify this? How does management, and have you heard like what kind of percentages management might be sharing in the tips?
Sure. I mean, there's a hotel worker that I've spoken with who had half of the service charges that were charged to rooms when they were doing room service conveyed to the owner of the entity as much as half, but it can be a smaller percentage. It is an issue because we are in really tough economic times, as we all know, and frankly, employers can ask you to bend over backwards in order to keep your job. And so what are you going to do? This is the way you make your money. This is the only job you have, and you're forced to choose either not have the job or give a portion of your tips to the employer. In these times, you might say, I got to keep this job.
In your instincts and what you've learned from your constituents, this is happening somewhat regularly.
That's right. That's
wow.
right. And that's why I think we need to deal with it and be in conformity with Massachusetts. My bill is based on the Massachusetts bill, so there won't be any differences. It'll be parity between the states. We often hear about people going from Rhode Island to Massachusetts for various purposes. This just makes us equal to Massachusetts in an important way.
If you're successful with this legislation, I hope there wouldn't be retribution back toward those service workers if indeed management can't share in that money any longer. I hope they won't take it out on the workers in some way. But I was not aware of this. This is very interesting, which I guess is a great lead-in to another question that has been talked about a great deal. The hospitality industry has been very vocal and very visible about the governor's proposal to increase the food and beverage tax here in Rhode Island as a means of dealing with some of our budgetary problems, generating additional revenue for our state. Your thoughts on that idea? Where do you stand?
Well, I think sales taxes and consumption taxes are generally regressive. The House Finance Committee is studying this issue. I don't sit on that committee, so they're pouring through the numbers and trying to find a solution that will work. And I look forward to seeing what their recommendations are on that issue.
We've talked about this on this show a few times. And again, just as somebody that's sitting on the sidelines and a guy that eats out from time to time, I would think that the person on the front line, i.e. the servers, the people that do work for gratuities, would be the ones that would feel the pain of this, because consumers might say, well, okay, we got to pay a little extra tax. How do we make up the difference? Well, we'll just cut down our tipping a little bit. We'll take it down 2% or 3% and try to make up the difference. I think that those folks are going to be the ones that really feel it.
Sure, and that's, I think, some of the work that the Finance Committee is doing to figure out exactly how much revenue that would be raised by this tax as proposed by the governor. When we'll see what sort of work we get out of the Finance Committee, and we'll go from there.
Representative, I know education is very important to you, and by golly, when I read your biography, you have a pretty doggone good one. I mean, you spent a few years at Harvard and went on to Harvard Law School, and that's where the air is pretty rare. You've worked on some legislation that will give Rhode Islanders an incentive to pursue higher education. I'll tell you what, I remember my dad saying to me as a kid growing up in a working class community, get an education, they can never take it away from you. And certainly with what we're doing with the knowledge community here in Rhode Island, education is important. Tell us about that legislation and how did it come about?
Sure. So in trying to move our economy forward, it's important for Rhode Island to build upon the assets that we have here. And you hear a lot about, I represent the Julie District, and you hear a lot about the meds and eds. And certainly we have world-class educational institutions. I don't think anyone would doubt that. But what happens, and I see it all the time, knocking on doors, again, in my neighborhood in Fox Point, I'll come across students who are just graduated from Brown University or Johnson & Wales, and they'll say, look, I'd love to stay. The quality of life is great. I love the neighborhood, but if I can't find a job, I have to go elsewhere. So what this bill does is it provides a tax credit for students that go to college in Rhode Island and then stay and work in Rhode Island. And that is, in my view, an incentive to try to retain the workers and to try to create a virtuous cycle where you'll have more young college graduates that stay, and therefore you'll have more employers that will want to move here to hire those graduates, which will inspire more college graduates to stay and continue with that virtuous cycle.
Well, but we still have to have the jobs for them. And what kind of a tax incentive are we talking about here in terms of somebody that goes to school here and then stays and works here?
It's a tax credit for student loans. So it provides a credit in response to the student loans acquired by the student over the 4-year period, which again, it may not lead all students who graduate here, and nor should we expect all of them to want to stay, but it might be that additional incentive that causes students to want to stay in our state. And again, if the workforce is here, and you hear it all the time, that if the workforce is here, the jobs will come here too. And it tries to start sort of from the supply, supply side of our workforce, increase the supply of college-trained, highly trained workers that will attract the employers that we wanted to build in the Jewelry District and throughout our state.
Yeah, and you know, we are very fortunate here in Rhode Island because we really do have great institutions of higher learning. It's really, I think, one of our great calling cards of Rhode Island. And if we can keep that talent pool and that knowledge pool here, studying here, working here, everybody wins, and that's going to bode well for our state, I think.
Oh, sure, absolutely, and that's really the goal here is to retain those people that have come through our system and have learned at our high quality educational institutions, to keep them here.
But you know, you were talking about tax credit for student loans. How about some incentives for business loans? I'm hearing a lot of small business people. We covered at Capitol TV the Small Business Summit back in January. They just had a follow-up meeting with some members of the General Assembly, and obviously they're concerned about staying afloat and thriving here in Rhode Island. And one of the common complaints that I heard that day when I attended the summit is that they have businesses that are doing pretty well, but they need money to expand, and loans for small business have not been easy to come by. You've been working on some legislation that tries to deal with that. Tell us about that.
Sure. There's actually 2 bills that have focused on these issues. And I have to say, Dave, I'm a strong believer in not reinventing the wheel. Rhode Island is a small state. The advantage of the federalism system we have is we have 50 states, which can be incubators of innovation.
Sure.
Other states have bills that have worked. My goal is really just to bring some of the ones that have worked to our state. The first is a bill that is based on a North Carolina piece of legislation. North Carolina is famous for turning itself from a largely agrarian economy, at least in the research triangle, into the kinds of meds and ed economic development that we would love to have here. What this bill does is it provides a small grant for innovative small businesses to apply for federal SBIR and STTR federal grants. These are grants administered by the federal government for innovative research and technology transfer. And they are provided to sort of spur the kind of innovation and technology that we've made policy decisions in our country that we want to see more of. And it's free federal money from the federal government, but Rhode Island actually doesn't get, even on a per capita basis, enough of this federal funding. The Providence Chamber of Commerce recently did a series of benchmarks about how we can improve our economy, and one of the areas where we're lacking and need to improve is in the way that we get SBIR, STTR federal funding. So what this does is it provides a small grant to help the small business apply for the federal funds, and then provides a state match to further incentivize people to go out and get this money for the innovative research development that we'd like to see.
How tough is it to qualify for? When you say innovative research, do small businesses have to jump through a lot of hoops in order to try to glean some of those loans?
There's a series of phases, and yes, you're right. And that's why you need a small grant at the beginning to help put together this application process, which is really about crossing your T's and dotting your I's in the right way. And those that have been doing the SBIR process have really learned how to do it. And so what has essentially happened is Rhode Island has fallen behind in this area and needs to have an incentive to go after these federal funds in areas like medical devices, pharmaceuticals, exactly the areas that you often hear the governor and our state leaders talking about being the future of our economy in our state in the Jewelry District / Knowledge District.
And when you talk about that I-195 project, which is going to hopefully build upon that concept, that could be a real bright spot for the city of Providence, which obviously you're selfishly concerned with because the people of Providence are your constituents.
Sure, and I represent the Jewelry District, and there are people right now that are living there, and in many ways they're pioneers, they're on the frontier of what will eventually be the first 21st century neighborhood in our city, in our state. And the development of the Knowledge District, the Jewelry District, is extremely important to me. Anywhere you go where you have the development of these kinds of areas, it's critically important to mix an area where people want to live, they want to walk around, visit the shops and restaurants, in addition to see parks, in addition to kind of economic development, businesses moving in and building, developing the area. You want to have a mix of that. And I'm proud to represent the area because the folks that live there right now are really on the cutting edge of what our state hopes to be in the future.
You have to be proud of the fact that right out of the blocks, your first year, you had some legislation become law that I think by everyone's observation was pretty pro-business, in that this law has been enacted that will help privately funded businesses that serve in the public good, that help them. Tell our viewers about that.
Sure. So the area is called social ventures, and it's an emerging economic engine in our country. And what it develops out of is if anyone who's ever worked in the nonprofit community, anyone who's ever worked on a political campaign, the worst part about it, everyone will tell you, is raising money. You are constantly on the phone, begging for folks to give you money to support whatever venture you're doing. The notion of social ventures is to create a self-sustaining model, a model that can eke out small profits and continue to build the engine of social improvement without having to rely exclusively on nonprofit donations. And what this bill does, it's the L3C legislation. It creates a new kind of LLC, which is called the Low Profit Limited Liability Company. And it is a hybrid type of entity that mixes a organization oriented towards the beneficial, community-oriented purposes of 501c3 with a for-profit model allowing it to sell equity stakes or membership interests in the organization. So it allows people, so when you're an investor in a social venture, if you just donate your money to a nonprofit, you're giving the money away, it's gone. So you're going to take a negative 100% return on that investment, the money's gone. With a social venture, I mean, maybe you're not going to get the sort of 10%, 12% improvement in your investment that we would have expected in the better times. Exactly. But you might get 0, 1, 2. You might get a small improvements over time. And you're happy to know that your money's actually going to something that can benefit our society. I think one thing we saw in the 2008 financial crisis is that you can put your money away in an investment that you think is going to take off and lead to prosperity and security in the future, and that can be taken away from you. So why not use your money to get maybe more modest gains, but to serve a social purpose that you believe in?
That's very interesting, because not only would you have this infusion of money for the social good, as you call it, social ventures, but it would be ongoing. It wouldn't be just a one-time, here's a nice check presentation, thank you very much, Hasbro, for your donation. If they're involved in some business enterprise and they use their business acumen, and I'm just picking them at random, of course it would apply to any business, if they use their business acumen for the good of the community or for some social good, then we're really tapping into a resource that is more than just money.
Sure, and there was a famous Supreme Court case, we've talked a lot about Supreme Court cases, but involving Craigslist. And the Supreme Court decided that if you're a public entity, you have to pursue the interests of the shareholders at all other expenses. So you have maximizing shareholder value is your #1 concern. But with these kinds of entities, there's an understanding that when you make an investment, look, you might not get your 15, 20% return or even a 10% return, but we're going to continue to try to build upon something and create a sustaining model of social good over time.
You know what? Maybe it wouldn't be the ROI that they're used to, but when you help someone else, or you help out a group of people, or you help make our environment better, if you do something positive for others, I submit to you, Representative, that's the paycheck in life you can't cash, because that's extremely, extremely valuable, and some might even say priceless.
Sure, and the alternative, I mean, look at the people's retirement funds being destroyed by the economic crash we had in 2008. There are no guarantees when you invest your money, so why not try to do something good with it?
I know, too, that a cornerstone of your agenda centers around education. I've alluded to your own education. and how important you view that for your community and your constituents. I know you're interested in changing the random selection process for our new type of charter schools called mayoral academies. What's the goal of what you're working on legislatively?
Sure. So I think one of our guiding principles in education in Rhode Island is that we try to provide a high-quality education to every student. And although we don't necessarily meet that principle all the time, we should always be focused on that. And that's why you see that students are required to go to school. If you live in a district and you're there, you get a free education. And that's one of the cornerstones of what makes America great and what makes our state great, is we provide that free public education. Mayoral academies they use public funds, and the state has become committed to them, and Providence is going to open up 2 additional ones with Achievement First. And it seems to me that you need to have an application process and a lottery process that allows all students into the lottery. Now, why is that important? Well, there are unfortunately students out there whose parents may not be the best advocates for education. I grew up working class family, but I'll tell you what, my mom and dad were always at the school making sure that they were advocates for my education. Mm-hmm. There are lots of students out there that don't have that advocate. So when the process goes around to apply for the lotteries for mayoral academies, they're out of action. They don't look out for their kid in this way, and so the student isn't even a part of the lottery and doesn't even get a chance to go to the mayoral academy. So the system that I'm hoping that we can develop is an opt-out system, where every student who would be eligible to go to that mayoral academy would be entered into the lottery. And then the parent, after the lottery happens and the letter goes out saying, congratulations, you've been entered into the mayoral academy, check here if you don't want your student to go. What that does is, for that kid that's out there that doesn't have the parents that are as engaged as we'd hope they to be, they also get a chance to go to this school. And I think that that is so important if we're going to continue to have mayoral academies, to have a system that allows every student the opportunity to go there.
It would give those kids whose parents aren't as activated a real voice, a real chance. In the minute or so we have remaining, we've often heard it said, as Providence goes, so goes the state. What does the General Assembly have to do with the remainder of this session and the remainder of this year to help the city of Providence continue to fight some of their economic challenges to make Providence prosper?
Sure. I'd like to first praise Mayor Taveras for being someone that is open to any solution that works. I know that he is willing to listen to every potential option and is willing to do everything he can to try to save our city. Last year, with the leadership of Speaker Fox, we were able to pass the entire list of bills that the Providence delegation was supporting and the city of Providence was supporting, including additional monies based on our pilot contributions to the city. And I think that we're going to look at the Providence's list of priorities, and we're going to do everything we can to support the city again this time around.
Are you optimistic things are going to turn around there?
I'm hopeful, and I'll tell you what, having a mayor like Angel, I think we're as good as we can be to try to turn this around.
Representative Blazejewski, thank you so much for being our guest. You're most informative, and we always enjoy having somebody here, too, that's a part of the Providence delegation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dave.
And my best to you and your colleagues in the House.
Thank you, sir.
And thanks, of course, to you for watching. My name is Dave Barber. Remember, you heard it straight from the Gavel.